the opening track of Love Forever Changes from 1967. So this is the rare album in the 60s, which I had never listened to coming into it. So I think it's maybe, I think it's maybe the 7th or 8th album that it was a true cold listen for me in terms of albums that we've done.
Oh, damn, look at John being all well-learned and everything like that. Yeah.
Well, it's just you stumble into stuff, over time. But how much had you guys known about this band?
Zero, although I recognize the opening track.
Gotcha.
Well, I knew the band. I've heard about this album, but I never heard any of the songs before.
So it was basically a cold listen for all of us.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Love. So Love was formed in Los Angeles in 1965 and was one of the first racially diverse bands of its era. In fact, some ways it's similar to like Sly and the Family Stone, who we said that about before, but Sly and the Family Stone was sort of fronted by African Americans, and the rest of the set players around were white and different races and female. This is kind of the opposite of that, right? It's kind of the set players are people of color, but the main singer multi-instrumentalist Arthur Lee. I'm not 100% sure. That's actually going to be a good cleaning the stacks next week. Arthur Lee's ethnic background. Not that it really matters, but I'm pretty sure that he is an amalgam of different things, and he was working with two Caucasian guitar players, Brian McLean and Johnny Eccles at the beginning. The original drummer was Don Conca, but Don Conca does not last very long, and he is replaced by Albin Snoopy Pfisterer. So that's one of the great names. So I seem to get a lot of the great names, don't I, in terms of the bands that I cover right here? So yes, Albin Snoopy Pfisterer is the drummer, Johnny Eccles is the guitarist, Brian McLean is the other guitarist, and Arthur Lee, singer, multi-instrumentalist, is the lead singer. This is kind of his brainchild. He had been recording since 1963 after he attended a Byrds concert and decided that he wanted to start a band, and he basically started adding people. He added, we talked, McLean, the guitarist, was a roadie for the Byrds, and Conca and Eccles were guitar players locally. He replaces Conca pretty quickly with Pfister, who was a session drummer, and he has an original bassist, Johnny Fleckenstein, another great name, perhaps Fleckenstein. I did not see a pronunciation anywhere specifically. He leaves pretty quickly and gets replaced by Ken Forsey, who is a surf guitarist. So you've got you add him from a surf guitarist. It is escaping me right now, but Ken Forsey was originally a member of one of the well-known surf bands, but he was not in the band when they released the song that you would know from the surf band. So he was in the incarnation that did not hit it big. So
just missed out.
He did okay here, yes.
Would it be the Surfaris? Because they're
the Surfaris. It could be. Yeah, it could be. I want to say that he was in the band that did Wipeout, if I remember correctly. But once again,
that would be the Surfaris.
The Surfaris, there you go. But he was not there when they did Wipeout. So yeah, so there you go. If I'm wrong about that, I promise I will clean that stack next week. But I'm pretty sure I'm right on that one. So Love was known for drawing on a wide range of music sources, which you definitely hear in this album. There's folk, hard rock, flamenco, jazz, blues, mariachi, orchestral pop. They veered into all of it. This album was their third album from 1967. They had two before it. A little bit of how they got to this album. The band starts by playing LA clubs in April of 1965, which, I feel like that period in mid 1965 in LA was similar to how like you hear about the early 80s in LA as well, when all the like metal bands, the hair bands were playing, you know what I mean, in LA, and you walk down the street and you see a band who eventually signed a record contract. I feel LA was a little bit like that because when we've been that's where the Doors were playing, Them was playing that we just talked about. You've got, Love playing there. There's other bands that we've talked about too.
Or Frank Zappa was playing.
Frank Zappa was there. If I remember correctly, I think the 13th Floor Elevators were there for a little bit before they went back to Austin. And so there's just a lot of different bands playing there. So it must have been an interesting time. So as they're playing these clubs in 1965, they get a good rep as a good live act. And they actually were well regarded by the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds in particular. They one of the interesting things about this band is they actually lived communally in a home that they called the Castle, which, Josh, you would love this because the Castle was actually like a mansion that was considered to be haunted. That was it goes back to old Hollywood in LA, and so they were living there communally and doing from all things a great amount of drugs during this time as well. And drugs will be a theme throughout the band in terms of how they broke up, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But
man, so I thought you were going to talk about Josh's, affinity for sex mansions. Is what I thought you were.
I did not get the feeling that this was I did not get a feeling that this was a sex mansion. This seemed more like a darker 60s, darker 60s mansion, in some ways.
Movie mansion.
Yeah. So they're living there. They sign with Elektra Records, and they release their first album, which is the self-titled Love. It's released in March of 1966 and sells moderately well by all accounts. They actually add 2 more members to the band between album 1 and 2. Michael Stewart comes in as another drummer, and actually this moves Snoopy Pfister, to the harpsichord from the drums. So Stewart takes over the drums and Pfister goes to the harpsichord. And then TJAY Cantrelli comes in on the woodwinds. So they're now a 7-piece. Keeping on the theme of Italian-themed albums, the second album is Da Capo from November of 1966, so same year as the first album. It is a way more experimental album. I gave it a quick listen a little bit, and for sure you notice it right away, and is received pretty well by critics. Doesn't sell quite as well as the first album. There's a pretty significant amount of movement between album 2 and 3, Forever Changed and Recovering. Cantrelli, the woodwinds guy, and Pfister, who went from drums to harpsichord, leave the band, and they are once again a 5-piece band going into Love, with the traditional pieces: the bass, the regular guitar, the lead guitar, the drums, multi-instrumentals, singer, along the way. So 2 guitarists along with a bassist. This album is looked at as being more avant-garde than some of their earlier work. We said experimental earlier, but the experimental was not necessarily avant-garde as much as just framework within a traditional framework, but just playing differently. This is a little bit of a departure, and it also has a much softer sound than their early albums. Some things to know about this album: it was actually recorded in 64 hours and utilizes quite a bit of session musicians, including some of the members of the Wall of Sound, which we've talked about before. Lee and McLean are fighting pretty much the entire album because McLean wants more of his songs on Love albums, and Lee is sort of saying, kind of, it's my band a little bit, and I'm the creative juices, and there was a little bit of a difference of opinion there about how much of a band it was for Lee compared to the rest of the band. This also did not get received well in the U.S. sales-wise. It only ever got to number 154 on the albums charts. It is better regarded in the UK, where it hits number 24, but I don't think you can really say that this was a hit in any way. Interestingly enough, and I feel like I've had quite a few bands that have had this story. We did the Zombies, and it's kind of a similar story to this. After the album, McLean leaves, and Lee just dismisses the rest of the band. He just fires them. So basically, this is the end of the Love lineup that created this album. Basically, Lee continues to record with the rest of the bands, and the rest of the band is dismissed and kind of does their own thing. Unfortunately, what their own thing is pretty fast. I mean, the band has quite a checkered history. Eccles and Forsey struggle mightily with drug addictions. Lee actually ends up going to prison later in the early 80s. And McLean has his own issues before reemerging as a Christian artist. McLean and Forsey actually both die relatively young in their early 50s. And Lee was still touring with a version of Love in the early 2000s along the way. So unfortunately, I feel like we have some semblance of that story quite a bit with some of the bands that we cover. The band kind of has that story a little bit for the most part, the Zombies, and so it's a similar story to that. The band does periodically reunite in future decades, but never with anything closely resembling the full lineup. 2 more things before we go into it. Love did not tour Arthur Lee hated it, and so they never went on tour, which is kind of funny because they were known, they broke for being a live band, but one of the reasons it was thought that they never really gained success was because they just didn't tour. They were also on the same label as The Doors, and so a lot of times they were really overshadowed in terms of the promotion by The Doors, who were kind of considered to be more of an it band than Love is, so they kind of fell by the radar. I think it goes without saying in terms of that communal house. This was recorded heavily under the influence of LSD and heroin by all members of the group. And one thing, I don't know if you guys noticed this, I certainly did as I listened to the lyrics, even before I'd done my research for it. I like to do my first listen before I do the research to not, be led to different stuff. But this album was kind of like that David Bowie album we did, and to some degree the United States of America album we did, where it was very much lyrically about the dark side of flower power and the 60s. And Lee said that, even though he was in it, he intuitively knew that, all of the mantras of love and free love and peace and stuff, concealed a very dark underbelly, especially in LA. And most of the songs on this album are about that. And it is very clear in writing this, especially when he wrote it, that he was seeing something that really would blow up in 68 and 69. A lot of what he was writing about, I think, is a little bit of that, what you think of when you think of the Manson family a little bit, people, big on drugs, kind of, without a moral compass, a little bit of darkness under, mantras and stuff like that. So that's a big theme of this album.
Very prophetic.
He said he both saw it and felt detached from it at times, but also lived it at times. And hence he felt this was a dark album. So there you go. A little bit longer bio than I normally do, but I found it to be kind of an interesting band. And I think there's probably a lot of people listening that may not know a lot about them. We started last time with Matt. I'm going to start it with Josh this time. What were your thoughts on this album?
I did not like this album. I also don't understand why it's so high on the charts. As Emily said, more like "Am Bored Again" when in reference to "And More Again."
Hey, she stole my joke.
And I have to agree with her on that. I did pick up on the Spanish flamenco type of sounds throughout the album. I got that. It seemed like a combination of that with folky and some flower child psychedelia. That was all kind of mishmashed together. Even got some English folk sounds in there. At times too, it also maybe sounded like Scott Walker or Nick Drake with touches of Santana thrown in. It's really kind of a mishmash, and none of it worked for me, and I didn't particularly like any of the songs. I did like when they would lean into those harder guitar parts. There are some cool guitar solos, on A House Is Not a Motel, about 2/3 of the way through. There's a cool guitar part there. There's also some really weird lyrics on this album, and something on Live and Let Live was "the snot is caked against my pants." I don't know if that's a euphemism or not, but also that song, "The Red Telephone," reminded me of a Pink Floyd song in some respects, just in terms of its structure and kind of the nonsense of it all. And I didn't really... This album was a little confusing to me. I didn't see what the big deal was. Nothing really stood out. I don't see myself listening to that again. I'm glad I got some bio from John on that, because I didn't know anything about this band. And yeah, I guess I'm just negative on this album, really.
Okay. Gotcha. Matt, what were your thoughts?
So I liked it. I didn't love it, but I did like it a lot. I think that part of the conversations that we have with albums that are in this part of the ranking, so ranked highly. I don't know if it deserves this high of a ranking, but I did find myself liking this quite a bit. I was very much way more interested in this than Van Morrison. It is. I agree with some of what Josh is saying, because I do think that it's slightly disjointed. There's a lot of different things going on, and you've already dropped a bunch of bands that you thought it sounded like. I mean, I was also picking up on Tim Buckley,
Yes.
And More Again is like a Tim Buckley type song, done better, I think, than Tim Buckley did his stuff. And I felt like something like The Daily Planet kind of reminded me of The Who. There was aspects of that I thought was
Yeah,
kind
I
of
would
Who
agree,
like
Matt.
with the bass and the drums up front, and with certain parts of it almost like theatrical, kind of like Tommy-esque types of parts where the vocals would kind of go off in a little bit of a different direction. So I saw a lot. You can definitely hear them incorporating a variety of different things. I really like the flamenco type, the Spanish guitar, the mariachi horns, and the opening track were really great. And I think that my favorite aspect of the record was like probably from songs like the Red Telephone through Bummer in the Summer, which I think was just a really strong sequence of songs, tracks 6 through 10. Taking it in a slightly different proggy way. I like the introduction of the guitar solos kind of coming out of nowhere. I thought that they really added to the overall sound. And it's got some of the orchestration. It's got like that 70s feel a little bit with some of the strings that are going on here. I thought that on my first listen or two, I thought that by the end of the week I would be loving this and being like, "Oh my God, I'm all in." I didn't. I don't think I quite got there, but I definitely like this, and I can see. I think it's interesting all the stuff that you were talking to John about. The anti. Counterculture, anti-hippie type sentiment. I mean, this is all done basically right in the middle of the summer of love. So you kind of have that interesting juxtaposition that these guys are like, yeah, not so much. Like there's some downsides to this. So even though that wasn't something that I was picking up, totally on or much at all, really, I think that even adds more of an interesting element to this. So I really like this. This was a fun listen. I don't mind that it's kind of a little all over the place. I think that added to its strength, and I think that there's some really good I don't want to say like parts of the different compositions here I think are really, really well written. Yeah, I think it's it's definitely a 60s record for sure. And it took a couple listens for me to really get into it, but I do like this album a lot.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Matt, because at one point you said, I kind of feel like it's a 70s album. I'm like, oh, this is like a quintessentially 60s album. I feel like it's as much a 60s album as I feel like any album we've listened to. With that being said, I really like this album a lot, and I really liked it more every single time I listened to it. I listened to it 3 times, and every time I listened to it, I liked it more. And I think one of the main reasons I liked it so much was because each time I listened, I really appreciated the musicianship. As Matt mentioned, there's some really good bass lines in here. There's some really good lead guitar that I didn't notice as much the first time around as I did, say, the second and especially the third time around. The layering and the production of the album, it doesn't jump out to you right at the beginning, but then it gets more busy and complicated as you listen to the album for those pieces. I thought the songwriting was really good. There were some good hooks on this album. I liked the ambition of this album. It doesn't sound like the United States of America album, but it's similar to me in the sense that it's very much a 60s album, but they take a lot of chances, and I like the chances they took. And so while everything didn't hit, it's a very ambitious album, and I like the cornucopia of sounds. And I think also in juxtaposition to that Van Morrison album where, everything kind of blended together, like you can't say that about this album. Right. I think it's also a testament to this album that, what have we talked about? Like 12 different artists, between the two of you guys that you thought it was referential to. And that's, to me, tells you that, it tells you how varied the album is. I know Matt said he didn't love it. It's not in my top 15 albums, but by the end of it, it started to get close to that top 20 for me. I really came to appreciate it quite a bit, and I think I would recommend this album to people who are ambitious music listeners because I think it's the type of album that people would like to stumble into and find, and especially people who are willing to give multiple listens to it. So if you're one of those types of people that's looking for something new that you might not be aware of and you have a little bit of musical patience, this might be the type of album that might be good to introduce into your life because it's pretty good. And yeah, that's really my takeaway. Like each song is unique in its own way. Some hit better than others, but there are folk elements to this. There are, Matt mentioned prog rock, and I think kind of what he's talking about is sort of, the inverted structure at different points, and the multiple instruments coming in at different times, because it's not like long-winded. It doesn't overstay its welcome either. It's 11 songs. I think it's about 44 minutes. So it's about an average length of 4 songs. And yeah, I agree with you, Matt. 6 to 10 in particular is a really strong run of songs. Now, with that being said, I also really like Alone Again or track 1 and The Daily Planet track 4. And I really grew to like Old Man as well, the 5th song, every time I listen to it. So yeah, I would say definite recommend for me. And after the first listen, it was going to be a recommend, but I don't know if it would be as definitively a recommend as it was the third listen. And I think you guys know I usually listen to these albums 2 times, and that's enough. This was one that demanded a third listen for me. So it was not an immediate set of bullet points for me. It was harder to get there and figure out what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a good example of a record that's hard to pin down on one listen, because and part of the reason that I say prog rock is because of that element that you think what's going on.
Avant-garde, yeah.
Well, not even that, but they just take it in a different direction. They take you in unexpected places, and they add different layers to it. And and upon the first listen, you're like, oh, where'd that come from? I wasn't expecting, And then as you listen to it more, you have a better idea of what they're doing, and then you expect it to come, and then you can see all the pieces kind of fit together.
Matt, because I've struggled would you say it's kind of like what Pink Floyd tries to do, but more in a pop sensibility than early Pink Floyd? Because I felt like it was sort of doing the same things that Pink Floyd was doing in the 60s, but it ended up kind of being more like 70s Pink Floyd. Not totally, but... Do you know what I'm saying?
It's definitely, I would say it's definitely an easier listen than the other 2 Pink Floyd albums that we covered by far.
Yes,
particularly obscure, Saucer Full of Secrets. I do think that there's parts of Piper at the Gates of Dawn that do have more melodic, catchy, poppier songs, or structures, but the production and kind of what they're doing, that's a little bit more avant-garde than this. I didn't really pick up a whole lot of Pink Floyd, maybe elements here and there, but that wasn't really what I got. So I might have to think about that a little bit more.
It's kind of its own thing. We keep referencing other groups, but really, I think what that really says is that it's not really any of them. It's kind of its own thing, and maybe we should be comparing other people to Love a little bit. Because I also would be fascinated to hear a little bit more of what the harpsichord and the woodwinds would sound like on the album where they were present, because they weren't totally present here, but there were, some of the session players, went in that direction. So I got, hints of it a little bit. So.
Well, it's interesting you said this band didn't like to tour. I mean, that you can only go so far as a band, I would imagine, if you're not touring and getting your name out, and that's maybe why I have never heard of this band before. It seems like is it another band that is influential with artists, and that's why the legacy is there and something like that?
I know that critics really like this album, and critics of all different tastes like this album. It's an album that definitely has grown in esteem over the years. It was well regarded in its time and in the 70s, but in revisionist lists, you know what I mean? It's one of those albums that's continually gone it's kind of like the Zombies, Odyssey and Oracle, right? It was well regarded, but it keeps climbing as people listen to it. And I can see why too, because even though it is very much a product of the 60s, you can listen to this now, and there's a little bit of the hints of some of the stuff that still resonate to this modern day, much more than, garden variety psychedelia, you know what I mean? And stuff like that. And as much as I loved like the Jefferson Airplane album and, Santana and stuff like that, they're kind of their time. I didn't feel that way about this. I felt like this could travel out of its time a little bit. And
that's another band, Jefferson Airplane. I hear that in here too with some of the more the more mellow songs. But I think that those are all good points. But yeah, it's its own thing. It is an amalgamation of a variety of different bands, and you're going to hear, if you listen to this, and you're familiar with a lot of other 60s artists, you're going to hear all that, I think, but they somehow do make it their own sound. And because I wasn't like, oh, this is a total ripoff of so and so. It was more like, oh, I could see kind of a little Tim Buckley in here. I can see a little of the Who or whoever there. So yeah, it was. I would say that I agree in terms of like the Zombies. It's kind of like this underground, lesser known band that's also, the album has become very lauded in critical circles. I think I like the Zombies album a little bit better, but this was still it's interesting, right? It keeps you on your toes. It keeps you wondering what's going to happen next, in a way that you're wanting them to take you in different directions because they've done so already in a way that makes that's good, right? There's melody here, there's cool instrumentation, and so they do it really well, and it just kept me wanting to hear more.
What's interesting, Matt? I would say this album doesn't have a lot of fathers and it doesn't have a lot of sons, because you can't really see where even the artists that say they love don't really. I mean, like Robert Plant loves this album, but also more modern acts. I shouldn't even say like some of the artists that really like cite love as an inspiration is like Primal Scream, Jesus and Mary Chain, and Stone Roses. But I know all three of those bands, and you don't, especially Jesus and Mary Chain, a band I really like a lot. It doesn't sound like them, So if you're familiar with them, I wouldn't even say like, oh, okay, that's it. It doesn't sound totally like that, and that's why I'm saying it doesn't really have a lot of children because it's its own thing, which is not a bad thing, but it's just
not at all.
No. Yeah. So
this was their biggest. This was their biggest hit, clearly, right? Because they broke up after.
Well, in its time or retrospectively, because it wasn't their biggest. Retrospectively, yes, for sure. Yeah. Like in terms of in its time, sales wise, it was not its biggest hit.
Mm-hmm. Which is not surprising. I mean, I wouldn't say that this is a quote-unquote accessible album, even though there's a lot of great parts of it. But it's not like you're not putting this on top 40 radio,
Right.
Yeah, and there's not really a single on this either.
No.
That's the other thing, yeah. Mm-hmm. So...
Yeah, I'm thinking... I think more and more there has to be singles on an album for me to for it to kind of pique my interest more or stand out. Yeah.
You're going to hate the 80s.
You're going to...
Because there's a lot of bands that are on there that they're not singles friendly. So, yeah.
And